Closed session previously. I'll thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it over to Kristen, I guess, to begin the presentation.
Thank you. Again, when I typically present, I would be standing at the screen, but because we want to be able to make this presentation available on the website, I do have a recorder in front of me, and so I'm going to remain seated so make sure it gets the best audio possible as we link it to the slides and this gets posted onto our website. So my apologies for not standing and presenting in that format. One area that I would like to call your attention to as we move through this is it's labeled School Finance 101 for a purpose. It's essentially what finance looks like if you were to walk into any school district, public school district in the state of Minnesota. There might be nuances that exist for Stillwater that don't exist for maybe some school in a rural community, and we'll call those out in a few slides, but all in all, the intent of this presentation is just to say if you were a board member in Little Falls, or Northrop, or Anoka, this is kind of how our funding works, this is how expenditures work, and it provides that lens. If you are here tonight to view the presentation as it relates to very Stillwater specific information, this presentation might be a little bit frustrating because that is not where we're starting, at least with tonight's conversation. School district funds. There are many categories of funds and purposes that they serve and how school districts keep track of different revenues and expenditures. Mainly what you will hear me speak to on any given night is the general fund. That is our largest fund. That is what functions on day-to-day, our day-to-day operations with the teaching and learning and all things that go into that. However, there are numerous other funds that need to be identified, and please know that when looking at these funds, you can't necessarily commingle or transfer between them. That's why they're isolated and separate. Food service, that is essentially anything that is in our food service operation, and community education. Those are the operating funds, and you will see that in an audit broken out that way. You will see that in a budget presentation broken out. Then you move into different funds that are more, I kind of view it as the daily operation of a house versus the house structure itself, the non-operating funds. They're essential for how we are able to conduct business, but they're not necessarily the day-to-day operations of that business. Building construction, that may or may not exist at any given time. For us, our building construction fund existed last with the $97.5 million, and it's slowly depleting, and once all of those bond proceeds are spent, that fund will go away and only reappear the next time we have building construction or pass a bond. Debt service is more like a mortgage. We take out debt, whether it's for 10 years, 20 years, sometimes 25 years, and we pay off that debt or mortgage and we collect taxes on it, and that's what that means. Trust is more where we keep scholarships. So money flows in and out, we hold it in a trust, issue scholarships to whatever entity is appropriate or whatever child or whatever the scholarship looks like, and that's how that money is depleted. Agency, not a lot of involvement with the agency fund, and that's more of something we hold, but it's someone else. We're the agent for another governmental unit. Might be a student activity account, depending on the school district that you're in, that we don't really have control over. We just act as the fiscal agent. An internal service fund, that is where our self-insurance fund lies, and we control that. OPEB trust and OPEB debt service are similar to building construction and debt service. OPEB trust is money that was put away to be used for future expenditures, and then the OPEB debt service was us issuing bonds. Originally, I think it was back in 2009. And we actually refinanced those bonds, and that was a 10-year issue. So as us collecting money from the taxpayers to pay that debt down, That will eventually go away because we will no longer have OPEB debt. However, the trust will exist until those funds are expended.
Oh, just two questions, sorry. Could you repeat Fund 9 agency? That's us acting as an agency? What?
As an agent to another unit.
An agent to another what?
Like another governmental unit.
Okay.
The best example, again, if you were in any random district, would be a student activity account. It doesn't, and school boards decide whether they have a control over those student activity accounts or not, but they can still hold the funds and disperse them appropriately. It just doesn't mean that we're the acting agent for those funds.
Okay.
Or we're the acting agent, but they're not our funds necessarily to distribute.
Thank you. And then could you just repeat internal service again?
Sure. Internal service is where we house like our self-insurance, our health and dental are sitting in the internal service fund.
Okay.
It's self-sustaining, and that's where that money flows in. But we collect the premiums, we pay for. It's a self-insurance plan. It's what's housed under Fund 20.
Okay. Thank you.
Main funds for district operations, and I'm going to, those of you who have been on the board for a little period of time, the reason why these are separate is because they both say Fund 1, and one says general fund and the other says capital and long-term facility maintenance. Fund 1 capital and long-term facility maintenance used to actually be different funds. Operating capital used to be Fund 5, which the state has rolled into Fund 1. We still track that money separately, but they now consider that a component of Fund 1, our general fund. And long-term facility maintenance, this occurred a few years ago, where long-term facility maintenance was actually run under Fund 6. If you remember, that was building construction. And with legislative changes, they've also moved that to the general fund. So I just wanted, again, I know I have varying levels of experience with where money once was, and so I just wanted to call those out. But there is a distinct difference between the two in that the capital and long-term facility maintenance is structural long-term components, and we actually reserve money for this. So when we work through our budget, and you look at a fund balance, and that fund balance could be $16 million. But I say, but yes, that's not the unassigned fund balance. It's because it's still including these components, and these components are set aside. They're reserved. And so they don't allow that flexibility that an unassigned fund balance does. So you have a fund balance, reserved, assigned, different categories, and then you have the unassigned fund balance. So that is why we still separate those two. We're required to separate those two and hold those monies for those particular purposes, even though they're all in the general fund. The other piece, the top line with the general fund, the day-to-day operations, salary, benefits, supplies, again, if you were running your household, these are just your essential bills that you pay daily, weekly, to keep things moving. Fund balance versus cash flow, and I like the visual image on this. You can see under the fund balance is your checkbook. It's actually more of your savings account. Fund balance is dollars that we have in a savings account. Once used, it's gone. So if you set aside, let's say $1,000 a year to be put away for a child's college expense, that can be considered personally like your fund balance. That's your savings account once used, gone. Cash flow, on the other hand, is more of money when you receive your paycheck and then the bills you have to pay. It's the ebb and flow of how much cash we have in our checking account at any given time. Now, this was more of a conversation at the state level when our state was struggling a few years back. It was more of a cash flow. So they took money from the district, and when I say took money, that means they borrowed money from us and said, we're gonna help support the state and what our balance sheet looks like. And we'll give you your revenue. We're just gonna slow the pace of when you get it. That affects our cash flow. And so the slower the pace of when we collect our revenues, the harder it is for us to meet our bills. because we know payroll is the 15th and 30th of every month. We know we have utility payments that due. And that is where you can get into, you could have quite a healthy fund balance. You could be sitting at 20% if you wanted to have money in a savings account, but it doesn't affect the inflow and outflow of your revenues and expenses. That's your cash flow. When things were really tough in the state of Minnesota, a lot of districts actually had to borrow to help subsidize and meet their cash flow problems on an annual basis, because we do get large sums of money in May and October for property taxes, big chunks. There are times where our general ed aid, if you will, is metered, and then we receive checks, and sometimes kind of in June it's offset. So it's timing of when we receive cash and can we make the bills for that month. Does that make sense? Where do we get our money? 4 categories, and again, this, you can be sitting in any public school in the state of Minnesota, and this is what it would look like for you. Maybe not the percentage, but certainly what it would look like. Federal aid, the federal government gets their money from income taxes and capital gains taxes. And the feds turn around and decide how they are going to distribute all of the money they collect nationwide for what programs. Very large scale budget. We happen to receive money for title programming from the federal government that they've collected, special education, and the National School Lunch Program. Now there might be a grant or two, and I noticed Ms. Van Cly is in the audience, where she had received the PEP grant. That was a federal grant, a specific application, and those will come in and out. But these are our mainstays. These are typically where federal aid comes from. State aid, so the state collects money off of, again, people's income tax and sales tax, or any other tax that they impose during their legislative sessions on how they do business, but that's the main category. And they turn around and give it to school districts in the general education formula allowance. Categorical revenue, and I'll get into more detail about what categorical revenue is later, and equalization. So these are the 3 pretty significant categories of how the state takes their income, what they've decided public schools get, and distributes it back to us. Local levy is voter approved and non-voter approved. We have 2 categories. They fall into different subcategories, but those are the 2 categories. And then miscellaneous local revenue fees. This could be anything. This could be gate. It could be fees that kids use to participate in an activity, just donations, just kind of the random things that happen at a local level.
Can you talk a little bit more about what kinds of things are non-voter approved? I think there's a lot of confusion about those 2 things. Which kinds of levies are voter approved and which kinds are non-voter approved?
Love to, that slide is coming up.
Oh, good.
So how does pupil accounting work? And we have, here pupil units, adjusted pupil units. Adjusted pupil units are the same as WADMs or ADMs. I think the easiest way to explain this slide is to say, we talk a lot about how many kids were in seats on October 1. And that is a number that is used for different funding streams for compensatory revenue, as I had mentioned before. That is a good snapshot in time for districts to use, because it somewhat establishes, okay, that's the head count. But there's a difference between the head count and how we actually get paid. And how it gets translated is, that head count on October, you might have a student that moves in or transfers in November, and you might have 3 that leave at Christmas time because their family moved. The membership is what gets calculated through the year. So just because that was our head count, membership gets adjusted through the years, and that's what we actually get paid off of. And then each child, depending on what grade level they're in, gets a different weight. So let's just say they were here all year long. Now, it's not days of attendance, they were just members in our district all year long. And they happen to be in first grade. Their weight is going to be a 1-0 off of the gen ed formula. If they are in secondary, their weight is going to be a 1-2. So assuming the gen ed formula was $1,000 and they were in first grade, with a 1-0, we'd collect $1,000 for that child. If they were in secondary, we'd collect $1,200 for that child. It was established long ago that the belief that secondary students cost more to educate than elementary age children. And so a weighting system was developed legislatively, and that is how it is applied.
How was that developed? Is that just from here on until that number 1 and 1.2?
Actually, a handful of years ago, the weightings changed.
Oh, okay.
It used to be a 1.0, a 1.067 for like grades 4 to 6, and legislatively they said no, K6 is 1. And these were nuances. They just had more formulas in there. They viewed it as confusing and just made a clear divide and said, and pre-K does not, they get less. They're a different weights altogether. But legislatively, they can change that. They have changed that.
So when do we get paid? Do we get paid ahead of time, or do we get paid on the backside of the membership?
So what happens is I make, or we make, I shouldn't say I, it's based on the head count. You can see a trend. Sometimes historically we're 3 years, we might be 2 ADMs to the good. You kind of watch this trend. Projections are made current year and 2 years in advance, because that's what our levy is based off of, and information that the capital is using as far as what expenses are going to be. Based on, we get paid off of our projections with the final bill coming, it's actually the next year based on the past year. So they start cleaning it up. We do different submissions throughout the year. We're getting paid based off of our estimates, and then if we're 50 kids or 50 ADMs short, that cleanup payment will come the following fall for the prior year. So it's relatively on time. It's just not exactly on time, because until the year is complete, you don't have the ADM, because at any given point, those kids could come in or leave.
So we've got pre-K in all our elementaries. What money do we get for doing that?
That .667 is the formula allowance for pre-K.
And that's the one that Governor Dayton is pushing to have more fully funded, I would presume.
And that's pre-K, not handicap kindergarten, because handicap kindergarten actually gets weighted at a 1.0 like a regular. Again, they estimate that the expense of that is greater than for a handicap. Someone qualifies as handicapped.
But the pre-K is 2/3 of a kid.
Yes.
2/3 of the kid.
Short.
Right?
Well, it's accurate. No, I just.
But that's what's going to happen when you use Wadums or something like that.
Right.
That's where we can get portions.
Don't we typically have smaller class sizes in K6? I mean, I would think that, being that our staff is the most expensive part of instructing a student, that it actually might be, you could make an argument that it would be the other way around, that it's more expensive to teach the younger K6 than it's, I mean, what's that based on?
I believe activities come into play.
Okay.
If I may, I think too, a lot of times it's like lab equipment,
Yeah.
or in particular in vocational education, where you've got a lot of capital.
The big AP books at one time were $180-some per book, so the materials.
I suppose that all adds up.
And then other, some formulas are just, they're based off of, again, pupil units translate, or adjusted pupil units translate into Wadums, but they're based off of a finite dollar amount, and, you get, what comes to mind is like, gifted and talented, you get $13 per, and that's what you get. So those are kind of the other categories. One student equals. Now, I'd like to point out that this slide applies no weight. So this is just saying, here are our formulas, and if your weight is a 1.2, then obviously the bottom line changes. But, so this is just saying, here is a straight 1.0 student that would attend all year. Here would be categories in which we would receive revenue. So the basic formula, which for this year is $6,188. Declining enrollment. This formula exists for school districts that are actually losing students every year. We happen to be getting 4182. And the intent is to say, okay, 28, I think it's 28% of the formula, and I might be wrong on this, 28% of the formula. So if we had 100 kids, now we're down to 50. We lost 50. We take 28% of the 50 that we lost, and that's the additional revenue that we get. Ours happens to equal 4182 per student.
So this is specific to Stillwater then?
This is.
This one?
There are other categories, again, school district, there are other categories that aren't listed on here.
That we don't
Sparsity.
qualify for? Okay, yeah.
Small schools that aren't Stillwater specific, but though, I mean, you could swap. This is what is specific to us, and again, it would probably apply to half. There might be a category here or there if you were somewhere else, but this gives you kind of a comprehensive view of what this means per student. And so I won't walk through every formula and how it's gotten, how we achieve that, but just to identify, to say some of these are flat. Like you can see gifted and talented, it's $13.
Yeah,
Doesn't change.
but the gifted and talented is based on 8,200 kids, not the number of kids who are in the GATE program.
Correct. Again, this is per student. And so declining enrollment is divided at whatever our revenue is divided out to give us the per student amount.
And is that legislation in place to give that to us to help offset having to do large staffing cuts, or do you know the thinking county-wide we get a declining enrollment?
Declining enrollment was established for districts, and honestly, I would have to say it's probably more rural, because sometimes school districts cannot keep up. You can't cut staff or keep up with the cuts quick enough as you are losing the students. And so it's to help kind of mitigate that, what could be a significant impact in any given year, by slowly inching you down to help you catch your breath and keep up with it. That was kind of the intent, is because you could have areas that are losing hundreds of kids at a time, and there's no means to support, and you just cannot cut enough to make that work, so they help to mitigate that impact.
So do you have to qualify for that, or do all districts get that?
If you're declining enrollment, it becomes a factor. Again, that dollar amount is not set per district. That can look very different depending on the
changes
district.
from year to year, or how often?
I mean, yes. For us, I would say, there's not, again, most of these numbers aren't significant swings because we don't see significant changes.
Okay.
But again, you could go somewhere else that has the declining enrollment, and that number could look very different than $41.
So there must be some sort of formula that.
It's a formula. Again, it's based on the net loss times 28% of.
Or did you just say that?
That's okay. That's okay. That's why I say I'm not going to walk through the formula, because it gets to be quite cumbersome. I'll just explain what the category is.
Okay.
Extended time. Money that is received for students that go beyond a regular learning year. Sometimes we need students, targeted services. Students that need additional help in the summer. Targeted services is geared towards our elementary age children. Credit recovery. We receive additional revenue up to a 0.2 of the formula. If you don't get any, if you were to service them beyond a 0.2 of, again, if their standing is a 1.0, beyond a 0.2, you're not going to receive additional compensation, but there is recognition that sometimes kids need additional support beyond the regular learning year.
And how does that, so that does not fluctuate very much? Like something like credit recovery, how do you, I mean, that's gotta be,
That dollar, well, again, it's based off of the number of kids you have doing it at a point too. So if we have 50 kids doing targeted services, or we have 150 kids doing targeted services, then that's a number that you're basing it on an actual pupil count, not GT where it's the total population.
So that is based.
Yeah.
okay.
Again,
Okay, got it, yep, thanks.
Compensatory is essentially your free and reduced monies. English learner, LEP, that compensatory and English learner actually combined in is what is now called basic skills revenue. Sometimes the state puts those two categories together separately. That's what they look like. Transportation sparsity. So even though we don't qualify for sparsity as a district, because sparsity revenue is based off of how close our secondary building is to our neighboring secondary building. Or elementary sparsity is if you have so many elementary students and you're more than 19 miles away, there's, you know, categories that fit as, you know, you've got quite a ways to go to get to the next school building. We don't qualify for that, but we do, however, qualify for transportation sparsity given the fact that we're approximately 150 square miles. We're a large district, and so we receive a sum of money for moving those students. The next two, equity and transition, are dollars that I would say exist for most school districts because they are legislatively driven. Equity is essentially saying, and it's the way the state categorizes is you have two entities. You have your metro schools and you have your rural schools. And they want, the intent is to have as much equality as possible. So if you are a low referendum, if you're a metro school who's on the very bottom of the referendum, other revenue collection, they say, you fall into this category, we're gonna help even it out a little bit for you. If you happen to be a school district that can never pass a referendum, you don't have, you know, students, whatever, we're gonna help support that to give you, to make it a little bit more equal than to maybe your neighboring district who's Wayzata. I mean, you know, to try to balance it out and make it a little more equal. And then they do the same with the rural.
Now, is that based on poverty level, or reduced? Who qualifies is the question you're really asking.
I know it is based off of referendum. I don't know if compensatory comes into that formula.
I'm just curious.
So based off of referendum, like our.
That's one of the components. And then transition, this is, and it's low for us at various junctures through the years, legislation has changed and has adjusted formulas and done different things. Transition is a category that says we're gonna hold you harmless. For whatever we've done, we're not gonna make sure you don't lose money as we adjust formulas or do different things. That's what transition is. School districts were held harmless or you were above the threshold, so we're gonna continue to make sure we make you good on at least where you are. That's what transition revenue is.
Is that in place forever?
Until, you know, the dollars supersede where you once were, and then it would, I mean, based on this, we were at some point not much above whatever they just did, and so I would guess if that formula continues to grow, it will eventually, for that category, phase out. Operating capital, we've discussed this in the prior slide. This is one of those reserved areas where the state of Minnesota recognizes that things need repair and replacement, and they give you dollars based off of formulas. Referendum is just that. We know what that is. And then alternative attendance adjustment. That definition actually changed, and essentially what it means for us today is this would be money that we would help that we would receive to help support the transportation of charters. That's essentially what it comes down to. Alternative attendance, they're going to a different spot, we're busing those kids. We get a small piece of that back.
Kristen, I'm curious, under compensatory, someone told me this at Valley Outreach. Free and reduced is what it's based on. And the free is obviously a higher or lower income level than the reduced.
Mm-hmm.
But in the state of Minnesota, all kids who are on reduced get a full lunch payment because the state picks up that difference.
Mm-hmm.
Does that resonate? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm just trying to verify.
Yeah, question about operating capital. How much leeway does the board have with that particular item? And I'm thinking
Say
of
more to that.
technology. Well, I'm thinking of technology. Does that fall under operating capital?
It could. Mm-hmm. We could, if we're putting in, again, I would say it's a limited source of revenue, but if we decided that back to we needed wiring, we needed, even a person to go through and help support the infrastructure of technology, even that person truly could go to operating capital because they're supporting something that essentially is lasting longer than a year and,
Is that kind of the definition, longer than a year?
that's depreciable longer than a year. I usually go the accounting terms with that.
One more I'm interested in.
And a
When you-
dollar threshold.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Where you talk about declining enrollment, is that kind of a floating formula then? In other words, if you declined enrollment, say over 10 years, you only go back so many years each year when you go to figure it out? One?
20. It's based off of what you have lost from the prior 1 year.
Okay, so it's not forever. Okay, and then similarly, transition, same thing?
Again, transition is based off of whatever we were held harmless with. And my guess is it was when legislative change, possibly even the weighting formula. Again, I don't know exactly what it was, but there was something that, let's just say when they switched the weighting formula, somehow we would have lost money.
Okay, I gotcha, because I remember it. That was that long ago.
No, it wasn't that long ago, and
Yeah.
somehow we lost, given the conversion to the new weights, we actually would have come out worse off than what we were. They add that, then they give that in transition.
And actually, both of those are really legislative compromises to get changes moving forward.
Yes. I would even say equity is.
So Kristen, when we have students that open enroll, students that leave our district or are opting in, what money follows the student? Is it just the basic formula?
This actually might be part of the transition also. So it used to be the categories listed with the exception of referendum. Because referendum used to be based off of resident students. So whether students chose to attend within our walls or not, we received referendum dollars for them. That formula has changed now, and so it's actually students attending. So if a student were to open enroll into our district, we receive referendum dollars for them, but their parents don't pick it up, our taxpayers do. Does that make sense? Because it's a local referendum. But that said, we also have kids that aren't within our walls that are attending a different Stillwater, a charter school or whatever, and we're not receiving money for them, and our taxpayers aren't being taxed for that. So.
And wasn't that with Matamidi, right? Because they have such a high percentage of open enrollment that I think residents there were talking about, we're actually paying the taxes on all these students coming in.
That,
right?
That is, yes, that is a discussion with Matamidi. And again, that formula has changed within the last handful of years. That's a new, it used to be resident and we collect on 10,000 students and now it's 8,500. But they adjusted the formula too. I mean, what was to make that work.
So you don't get, there are no funds that come from, like let's say we had students from Matamidi that open enrolled in into our district. We're not getting any funds from Matamidi per se that follow those kids.
Unless it's special education.
Special ed you would, but not for regular students.
Well, you get the basic, you wouldn't get anything.
You don't get the,
Is that-
you
Oh,
don't
just
get
the
the
basics,
referendum.
right, okay, got it. Yeah.
And we felt pretty low, right, with that referendum. Because I know, it was the West Side, right, they got grandfathered in years ago, but their cap is much higher.
Their cap is higher.
That's what I was just trying to bring up.
And
But
it's
some
three
of
of
them,
us
I think, fall
Oh,
on,
okay.
or like, I think Mounds View is in there, I think Roseville is in there. There's about 13 of them.
That are above the cap,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, they're grandfathered in.
And the formula allowance, again, it's $6,188, and this is what, when we hear at the Capitol that we're getting 2%, this is what it's on. Sometimes, and there's all the other categories, some are linked to the gen ed formula, some aren't. And so we might get 2% on other categories, and you can't just assume it's 2% across the board. It might just be 2% on the 6188. One of the nuances that comes through during bonding years.
Okay, so is adjusted pupil units the same as average daily membership?
WADM's weighted average daily membership. Again, it comes down to how long we were there with their weights attached. Revenue by source. Now this is Stillwater specific. You can see that 68% of our state aids, or of our revenue is coming from state aids, and 26% is local levy. By far the lion's share of the revenue received. We do receive a small portion for federal aid, and unfortunately that continues to get smaller as our title programs go down. And then miscellaneous is actually greater. The things that we collect from receive from our local, that falls into the miscellaneous category. And so this is kind of back to full circle. What does that look like, in a home budget? Well, if it was $1, we'd be receiving 68 cents from the state and 26 cents from property taxes and 4 from local and 2 from aid. Just a different way to view. We've heard before, you can only spend $1 one way, we only can collect $1 one way, and this is the cent breakdown of what that looks like. This slide, because we have conversations, and you'll see this again at the Truth in Taxation hearing, what is the district comparison? Now, this is not our levy authority. Please realize that what our authority is different than what the impact is to our taxpayers. And so for taxes payable, this isn't going to be reflective of any election cycle or anything that's happened this year. This was information from a year ago at this time. What does a $250,000 home, what would you pay in school district taxes if you lived in South Washington County, Matamidi, Chisago, and Stillwater? What does that look like for a homeowner? So if you were literally to pick up your $250,000 home and move it to Matamidi, you would probably be looking at an additional, and again, I'm just going to do a very quick math, 14, you're gonna be looking at an additional $400 to $500 in property taxes just because you moved your $250,000 home to a different school. Again, as we move into different conversations, and Truth in Taxation is going to be the first, but as we look at everything, what does it mean? Again, it's not what we collect, but it's what is the impact, what is the taxpayer paying for a home in our Stillwater School District.
So basically, we are the second lowest
Of our comparables.
of the comparables here, second or only to Roseville.
And below state average.
Below
Now
state
again,
average.
there was a lot of questions on the ballot this November. I don't know how that would change this makeup. But yes,
Yeah, Roseville passed a pretty hefty
Yeah.
sum
Where is the state average again?
very bottom line.
Okay.
And this was, I remember having this conversation when we were talking about with the preliminary levy, and there's a difference between what the dollar amount you levy for and the impact to your taxpayers. Just because the dollar amount you levy for either increases or decreases it doesn't necessarily coincide with what that means to your taxpayers.
Say that again.
So I'll go back to September, and we had a conversation and looking at a dollar amount and saying, it looks like we're going to go up $1 million. How can we collect $1 million more? And at that time I said, yes, but at least the philosophy from up until this point from the school board has been not what we collect, whether it's $1 million more or $1 million less, it's what is the impact to the taxpayer. Because as your tax base changes, the impact to the taxpayer changes. And our tax base is growing, and so the impact is mitigated through that tax base growth. So we could go up $1 million, maybe even $2 million, and again, and might see a very nominal increase on a $250,000 home, no increase, whatever that looks like. I'm just saying, you can't presume that the increase or decrease in the total dollar amount of your levy has a direct correlation to an increase or decrease to your taxpayer. Because that's not necessarily the case.
Well, and so in reality, if we had 500 more homes pop up, my portion should go down a little, right? That's how we look at it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the balance got to be different, because it only talks about this will increase.
Right, right. And again, and we will be having that conversation of here is the levy amount you're going to adopt, whatever that is. Is the conversation about that dollar amount, or is the conversation about what is the impact to your taxpayer?
See, I don't know if it's just recently, but I think most taxpayers have received a couple things from Washington County. Mm-hmm. And they keep doing this with Ramsey, Hennepin, so on. And I wonder if we shouldn't be more forthcoming about this kind of document when we send things out. And not, necessarily put them on a page 6, but that's a key thing I think that our taxpayers need to know. Because I don't think a lot of people would realize this. And if we think this is an accurate slide that tells people $250,000 home, here's the impact. And I think your statement, if you picked up that home and moved it to Montevideo, I think something like that is a good way to get people to realize they're getting a pretty good deal given these comparisons. Now you could pick Northrop or whoever you used earlier, and it's going to be a lot different, but those seem to be districts that we would be at least in the neighborhood and would be comparing to for a lot of things.
Categories of levy. And this, again, the main components we do have Fund 4, which is community service. Just identified kind of the key ones. So voter approved, we have operating and building bonds. Your operating is what we went out for in November of 13, and said we need this much per year, or per student per year for how many years. Dear voters, do you agree with that? They did. Building bonds was the last one, again, was the $97.5 million. There are other components, the non-voter approved, that exist for a variety of reasons. Some are formula driven, some are finite dollar amounts. When I say finite dollar amounts, I'll go specifically to the reemployment. We can seek reimbursement for people who have become unemployed and have collected benefits, and we have to pay on those benefits, and so we can collect money from the taxpayers for that. Long-term facility maintenance is another one for us, where we can set a dollar amount and say we're going to do roofs and parking lots and whatever on any particular year, and we need this much money to keep our buildings in decent repair. Yes.
I see you trying to take notes on them. We'll also post these so that
Yes.
you have these slides.
Yes.
So you don't have to-
And building lease, for us, that was the ALC, any instructional space, and it's also actually like things like ice time, things that we would use the rec center for activities, those are building lease type of things. Other things that come into play, and this is where, are formula driven, and they just come from the state as part of, here's your authority, we might have bargained for it to make it work. Be careful though, because some of these, and we'll identify this when we get to a different understanding school district budget cycles, is if you under levy, if you choose to say, you know what, the state said we can levy for this, you know, this much money, that's their formula, we can do that, but we don't really want to levy that much. Sometimes there's a negative impact in what we collect in aid, because they say, oh no, you're going to levy that amount because we need you to collect, you need to collect that amount. If you do, or if you don't, and you choose not to, you're going to lose aid too, because we strongly advise you to levy for it.
So how much is that an issue? How many of those areas does that affect?
I would have to go and research that.
I'm wondering, so I'm looking at this and I see long-term facility maintenance and operating capital, and where is that different than our other funding sources or is it different? Or is this additional needed per year funding for a specific purpose, or?
It's just, so sometimes there are categories that it's a source, right? We get operating capital as a source of revenue. We might get it in aid, we might get it in levy, we might get it in both. This is just identifying non-voter approved levy categories. We might only get it in levy. Long-term facility maintenance is only levy. However, if we were sitting in Northrop, we might get half of our operating capital based on formula through this, and then we also levy for a little bit, you know, it's a combination. So it's not necessarily a one or the other. State levies sometimes come together in their formulas and how they work. It could be a perfect example is QComp. Granted, it's our choice, but it gives you an example of how it works. QComp, legislatively, it was stated you can receive $260 per student to support your QComp program. Part of that, we're going to say is aid. We'll cover you for $100 and whatever dollars in aid. The other $90, if you want it, go get it in levy. It's a total $260, but there's two different categories of how you get to the $260. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. And then are each of these categories always used, you know, like every single time we've got a non-voter approved levy, we've got something set aside for career and technical reemployment, safe schools, so that, or is it just this particular non-voter approved levy cycle, it's only for abatements and achievement and integration, or?
These ones for us are pretty consistent. Again, remember the equity formula existed, and I identified this on the other side. It exists because the state of Minnesota wants to provide as much of a balance between maybe low referendum districts and others. That would be one that if we under levy, we're probably going to lose some aid with, because they feel very passionate about that mission. These categories, again, unless achievement and integration went away, are probably going to stay. One that has gone away, is actually was there on the last levy cycle and is now gone on this levy cycle, is the general education levy, where the state actually said, we're going to collect $20 million statewide and use that to help support your gen ed aid. So every district had a levy for a piece of that gen ed levy, and it was only through fiscal year 18, which means we've already levied for it, and it went away. So there are categories that can go away, but I would say these ones hold pretty constant.
So you may have said this already, but OPEB would be where? In the local option? Or if we were to levy for that?
So OPEB would be, well, you could do it two ways. The way we've discussed it would be non-voter approved. You could go to the voters and say, can we issue another $10 million of bonds to help support OPEB? That would go to the voters.
So if we did
Do
the
you-
non-voter approved, where is it just another category?
It'd be a new category.
Do you have to do the non-voter approved first in order to go to the voter levy? Or voter approved? No.
So, and just to clarify too, so the non-voter approved levies are things you have to do again every single year. Is that right? You go through and do them again every year, you identify what your needs are, and then you levy for those funds.
I pause to say have to. I would say these are consistent with what we've done every year.
So don't we go through the truth in taxation and all of that process happens every single year?
Yes.
And we have to declare to the community, this is what the extra expenses are gonna be for this year. The state has asked us to request those, or to declare to the community, this is what we need, we're gonna be asking for this in a non-voter approved format.
Correct.
And that's what the truth in taxation thing is all about.
But we
Correct.
don't
And these
approve
are
it.
also categories that the state has basically said, look, these are really important. We don't wanna leave these up to the whims of a community or whatever. These are really, really important for the functioning of the school system. You know, long-term facility maintenance, we can't have roofs falling in, we can't have, you know, doors that don't close all the way, and, you know, whatever. These are important pieces that have to be paid for.
Correct. Safe schools is another one.
Yeah.
That one came into play a long time ago for, you know, and it's for particular reasons.
But aren't there some, to your point, so as I understand, some of the gubernatorial candidates are wanting to propose legislation that would not have the funding levies out to the voters, that it is an automatic, just because it's leading to such disparities and inequities in our state. Because you look at Forest Lake, they were one of the few that was not able to, and have not historically been able to pass referendums, and talk about having to make some, you know, just like us, incredibly painful cuts. So I think that it'll be interesting to see where the state goes if they feel that, you know, children's future should not be, kind of like you said, at the whims of the public to say, oh, well, maybe we will fund, maybe we won't, because it's just such dire consequences.
For the non-voter approved, that's up to the board of each district to decide, right?
I would say all of the categories are up to the board. If you looked and you said, for the operating referendum, we want to under levy that category, you have every right to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every category on the levy is the board's right to be able to at least under levy.
And so then it does come down to being sensitive to what the situation is in the community. You know, if there's financial stress and strain on the community as a whole, then you might choose not to do some of these things because you realize what the impact is gonna be on the community, right? But, you know, that's the job, I guess, is to try to figure out what can we handle, what can we, you know, as a community, what can we handle? I can imagine some small towns in rural areas really struggling with some of these things, you know, because they know how hard it is for each member in the community to get by, to ask for every dollar is really important. It's, you know.
And it, you know, it's very, I would say honestly, it's very school district specific.
Mhm.
I know metro school districts that, quite honestly, will, to keep their school, are willing to pay, I mean, my history is St. Anthony. St. Anthony was willing to fund quite well their schools because they recognized that there was a possibility that Mounds View, Roseville, Columbia Heights, and Minneapolis are right there.
Mm-hmm.
There are other areas where, you know, again, every community brings a different set of circumstances that
Mhm.
local board needs to weigh.
Yeah. And I can see what you're saying, Paula, with the idea of, you know, some of those funds just coming straight from the general, you know, education formula. But then that every time you make too, so that would be tough. You know? It might be more fair, you know, because every community's different, but.
Revenue by fund. Again, our largest fund, the general fund, is 84%. Food service is 3%, community service is 5%, and debt service is 8%. You see building construction, again, we're not getting new money per se into that fund, small amounts of interest that will soon be spent down in trust. You just assume the money, because of scholarships, the money that comes in is the money that leaves, and essentially it's a zero budget. I think we budget maybe $25,000 a year. It might be greater than that, but what we receive goes back out again. Moving into expenditures, and this is program categories. We hit this typically during the budget conversations. This is UFARS, if you will, Uniform Financial Accounting and Reporting Systems. It's what governs all school districts on how they report their information to the state. Here are your categories based on what is administration and the definition. District support services, you get into your different forms of instruction, community education, instructional support and pupil support. Instructional support services is there to help support our instruction, our teachers. You can see it's curriculum, staff development, those sorts of things. Pupil support is there to support the child. Counseling, psychology, transportation, those items. And then sites, buildings, equipment, fiscal and other fixed costs. The fiscal and other fixed costs are things like our property and liability insurance, kind of something that doesn't fit into any other category. And so where does our $1 go? 45 cents on the dollar goes to regular and vocational education, 16 cents to special education, 15 cents to operation and maintenance, 7 cents to transportation. Now, this will, again, look very different depending on the district you are in. We're, again, 150 square miles, give or take. And so this is a large number, probably compared to Matamidi. Instructional support, again, there to support our teachers. Pupil support, there to support the kids. District support services, school administration, and other fixed costs. That's, if we were to have to divvy out our $1, that's the breakdown.
District and school administration, can you elaborate on that a little bit? What is that?
So you're looking at, if you look at administration, your general administration, building level principals, you can see school site administration, instructional administration. It's essentially anybody at your building level that would be titled administration up to your superintendent.
Okay.
And then the support services, that's where you get into people, kind of your non-licensed, that could be in that administrative support, which would be the business office, human resources, and technology.
And have those numbers been pretty steady over the years? Pretty, you know, with all the .03, has that been pretty, yeah, pretty standard? Has that fluctuated very much?
In my time here, I don't believe we've moved off of 3 cents.
How about special education?
Special education has increased. I want to say it probably was 13 or 14 cents before, and now we're closer to 16.
Kristen, do you have any idea how much money we get from Perkins funds? Is that a couple $100,000? Carl Perkins is vocational.
No, it's not that high.
It's dropped, I think, it's not.
Yeah,
It's
it's
not
pretty
that
low.
high.
Because my follow-up question almost to that too is, for our students who go to Century College or Curran Tech there, do they get Perkins funds that we're able to build off of? I'm just curious, and I don't do that right now.
I think if I were, it's kind of like gifted and talented. There's money there, it doesn't support the entire child.
Yeah.
So when you say the kids that go there, there is a small method that helps support those students, but by no means does it support those students.
Yeah, well, what I would wonder is typically Carl Perkins funds go to the state, and then the state gives those to districts. So, for example, our kids who go to Century College who benefit from those programs, does money go directly then to Century College for those kids? And then other kids who we service here at our locality, do we get Carl Perkins for them? And granted, it's pretty low.
I would say it's going to Century.
Yeah. I'd be curious sometime.
The majority is.
Yeah, because especially where it may become relevant as there's, for example, George and I attended an outstanding speaker this morning at Century College. So if you're looking at those areas and say you're expanding, if we had, say, more ambitious programs, would we qualify for more Perkins funds? I don't know.
I think we qualify for more, but it still wouldn't be enough to support full
Equate,
instructors,
yeah,
but it
yeah.
helps.
But it'd be interesting to know even what proportion.
And then, again, as we break things down farther, you go from here's your program to your object. So 100s are salary and wages. That's how you look under a particular code for anyone in the district that's an employee. And the last number on that code is somewhere in the 100 series. Benefits are 200, purchase services 3, supplies 4. So we have, again, different categories if you want to break down the nuances as we eventually get into detailed budgets. And where does that go? And again, this is based off of general fund dollars. Salaries and benefits, you can see that, you know, essentially 74 cents on the dollar is going to staff. And that is, that would be to be expected. We are a customer service industry, if you will, in supporting the students. And so not a surprise where the vast majority of our dollar goes to. Purchase services, again, you can see capital expenditures, supplies and materials, how that breaks down. So I had talked about earlier, there's different categories of fund balance and some things that the state makes us set aside dollars for. And again, you can see that 74% of our general fund is salary and benefits. In restricted revenues, when you start saying the state says, okay, please set aside this much and you know you have this much in operating capital and you have this much in long-term facility maintenance. Somewhere with all of the criteria that comes with the dollars that we receive, 15 to 17% of that is in restricted. We're told how to spend that money. Staff development would be another example. What that means is this usually leaves of our entire general fund budget about 11% a year that you actually determine how it's spent.
We have control over 11% of the general fund.
Unless it's coming in staffing, yes.
Wait, that's 11% of the total budget.
General fund budget.
General fund.
The general fund.
Is OPEB is in there as well?
General fund.
So is OPEB part of salaries and benefits then?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe so.
Okay.
Not sure. Believe so. So, I mean, that is a little bit of a, and obviously looking, it's a little bit of a startling thing when you realize that at the end of the day, the flexibility comes down to 11%.
Even that sounds high. In terms of really discretionary, there are degrees of
There are
discretionary.
right, it's not I mean, you might view it as, again, you're coerced, but you're not
Well,
set
what
that
I'm
way.
thinking of is it's almost like a personal budget, and if you said, okay, this is my fun money, that's really not fun money.
No.
There are degrees of how discretionary it is.
Well, and again, discretionary, if you start saying, well, yes, but we need to buy supplies, well, now your 11% just became 9, you know, we're going to do testing, it slowly takes away from that. And then timelines, 3-year accounting timeline, and there is a draft in front of you. You can see just completed we'll get the auditing fiscal year at the same time. We're moving on to the next operating fiscal year and budgeting for the fiscal year beyond that. So we always seem to be living in 3 years. With our budget deadline, meaning you need to approve a preliminary budget by June 30th. Otherwise, we can't legally expend money. And so sometimes this creates, and actually most of the time, we lack lead time with legislative decisions, and so preliminary budgets are based off of our best information at a particular period in time, usually without final legislation.
And obviously, one of those is staffing.
It's a
I mean,
perfect.
that's really a hard one because it's such a huge chunk.
So our staffing, when we go through the process and we have contracts that we have to honor, we need to let staff, and out of professional courtesy also, right? Let our staff know if they're going to be here or not be here. By we usually try the beginning of April. And many times, if we don't know what's coming in legislatively for our budget and what we might be able to afford and not afford, we don't know what we're getting for title funding, if we don't know what we're getting for Read With Me, many of those we don't find out till summer. And so we have to make judgment calls on what staff we can afford to keep and not, and what risk we want to take and not, as far as who stays and who goes based on money that we aren't sure of that we may be getting every 2 years. So, you know, it seems for most people a system that doesn't really make sense. It actually really doesn't make sense because we're making decisions based on kind of if-then statements versus having a set amount of money.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Denise, because, you know, when I present, and it's a very challenging piece to present, is the if-then. I will stand, when I'm standing at the podium and you are directing questions, and it's, as I review, sometimes the board meetings to say, you know, maybe I should have answered that in a different way. The challenge usually comes in is the question guided with me if then? Well, and you'll hear me say, if we do this, then this is what happens. But that picture changes if we don't do this. So you almost start going into different grids, and it's a very hard thing to present to because every decision can change the next answer. And so it seems a little bit slippery, but unfortunately that's how it works. It's if you do this, then this is your next response, and that's how, honestly, the budgeting, the staffing, the what have you, there's some degree of that in everything we do. If we levy for OPEB, then it means this, this, and this to taxpayers' general fund, you know, ability. If we don't, it means this. If you modify, I mean, there's so many different variables depending on the if. And that's the biggest challenge to present, because as we get farther down into compressed Stillwater budget, that's where you hit all of those questions.
Well, you've got contracts, you've got courtesy, and you've got a legislature that takes their sweet time usually getting to the funding discussions. And so you've got to make those decisions based on contracts and courtesy, but they don't have that same deadline.
Correct.
And so that becomes the mess that you have to present to us and hope we are guessing right,
Yes.
basically.
There are informational websites available that would honestly help anybody as they look at School Finance 101 to help guide you through the process. Of course, I am available. If anybody wants to reach out with their questions, I am more than happy to try to answer it, even though sometimes I struggle because I do live in this world a lot more than others to try to communicate an understanding. I'm actually going to ask Director Lehman to speak to, now we're going to move into the Stillwater specific components of the budget to a small degree tonight.
So when I joined the board in 2010, I got on the negotiations committee, and a couple of themes became evident as a result of going through that process. The first was, from the teacher perspective, a disconnect as to how were the district showing their budget relative to actual expenditures and costs. And also, I think from the board perspective, at least for me, why at certain times did we show a surplus in the general fund and the fund balance versus what occurred at the end of the cycle. And so I think it was founded on, there was a concern that we were being very conservative with regards to budgeting, and it was through Kristen's leadership that she formed the budget committee that looks at assumptions going forward relative to planning a budget. So this year the budget committee consists of Director Pearson, Mark Drummerhausen, principal at Brookview, Andy Fields, principal at Oakland Middle School, Dr. Hill, who's the SCEA president, Board Chair Hepner, Kristen, Todd Kapsner, who's on the teacher negotiating, myself, Superintendent Pontrelli, Lynn Ritzer from Kristen's office, and then Darby Whitehill, who's also the SCA, one of the representatives, and who has a really strong background in budgeting and looking at how that's all put together. So this committee meets and has met, I want to say it's been at least 3 or 4 years now. And we're charged with trying to come up with assumptions that seem reasonable and are not too conservative, so that at the end of the year our numbers are overly inflated or too liberal, so that at the end of the year we've under budgeted for a lot of these expenses. So what we looked at was, first of all, what's a reasonable length of time to budget for? And we decided it was probably more appropriate, rather than do 5 years, that we would budget out for 3 years. So the committee this year was budgeting for 2018-19, 2019-20, and 2021. And so what we looked at was, obviously knowing that our revenue comes from the kids in the seats, we took a look at enrollment projections, looking at the various ranges. And when we looked at enrollment projections, we look at both kindergarten and also elementary, because those are usually where, you know, most of the bang for your buck, because once you get them, they're going to work forward. So what the committee came up with was we would use a low kindergarten, or slightly above low kindergarten, high migration numbers, and Kristen can explain how that comes out. But for the total enrollment for 2018-19, we figured 8,210 students. For 19-20, we figured 8,215 students. And for 2021, 8,220 students. For kindergarten, we figured a little slight loss due to the charter school. So for 2018-19, we figured 550 kindergarten students. 2019-20, 569 kindergarten students. And for 2021, 573 kindergarten students. And this is the committee decision based upon the information that were provided with regards to Hoheisel's study, communication with various municipalities. We talked about the growth we're seeing in the south. There was conversation with Lake Elmo as to what their growth projections are. So based upon all of that, that's what the committee chose for the numbers for budgeting purposes for revenue for the students in the seats. We also look at what the general education revenue will be from the state. We figured in 2018-19 it would remain at 2%, and then figured a 1.5% increase for 2019-20 and 2020-21. We figured no change in tax and age shift. We talked about the literacy incentive aid remaining constant at $415,000. No change in compensatory revenue, no change in referendum revenue, maintaining the status quo on QComp. We figured special education funding will will grow about a 4% factor each of those 3 years. And then all other formula-driven revenue will follow the general ed formula, and that there be no changes in miscellaneous revenue. So not only do we look at the revenue, we also looked at the expenditures. Obviously, contracts are the biggest expenditure we have. We figured 0% increase with roll-up costs for steps and lanes. We figured health insurance would remain at 3% for those 3 years. Dental insurance would start out at 3% for 2018-19, and then would go to 0% for 19-20 and 2021. We figured we'd be making $1 million annual payment to the OPEB trust. Staff development would remain at 2%. Transportation costs would go up 2.5% in 18-19, 2.25% in 19-20, and in 2021 another 2.5%. We projected retirees would stay at 12, so we figured that 12 would retire each of those 3 years. We figured the savings based upon those 12 retirements is about $19,608 per person. Severance would go to $700,000 per year for each of the 3 years. Obviously, the reason we do that is to incentivize the retirement. We figured 2.5% increase on utilities, 5% increase on property and liability insurance, and 3% on workers' comp. And then we figured supply materials would increase 2% per year. The bottom line is then to give us a better handle on budgeting so that we can look at what that 11% is or whatever, so that we can apply it to programs going forward. So.
Well, I have 5,000 questions, but I'm just gonna, first of all, is this gonna be sent out for us to digest?
It will.
Yeah.
And for the public to?
Absolutely.
Okay. So when you, given all these factors going into, so just 2 main questions, I guess, for now. Going into the general fund after all of this is calculated and whatnot, something like additional programs, and I just am going to be doing it again, is the 4th grade orchestra, for example. Sorry. Where does that conversation take place?
Well, and so what Tom has read off is the budget assumptions are made in a collective. It's not one person sitting in the room, it's made, it's a collective decision. That creates, if you will, kind of the sandbox of which decisions can then be made. You're going to, based on those assumptions, projections are done to say, this is what we believe the expenses will be, this is what we believe the revenues will be. Please go ahead and make adjustments as you see fit. This is where we are with kind of the unknowns, or what if we were to just roll forward. This is what financially it looks like. It still allows, the board the opportunity to make, whether it be budget adjustments, whether it be programming, that's all still exists. This just gives you if all things were to roll up as is, this is what our financial picture looks like.
So, okay, thank you. And so when would that happen? And then, when does that happen? If that question makes sense. And then 2, the 0% increase steps and lanes. Can you clarify that?
Yes. So
okay.
We assume, based on committee, the committee doesn't commit what even a perception of what contracts will settle for unless they're already done. Then we put the known costs in there, like contracts just settled for 18-19. Those costs are just going to go in there because they're done. But the committee assumes that the board isn't going to put a hard freeze on, meaning that they're not going to say nobody gets steps and lanes, everything remains as is. We're going to assume people are going to continue to get steps and lanes. The board, but we're not going to put any contract increases on contracts that don't exist, because that's the board's opportunity to say, this is what we believe should be given in contract increases. We don't want to pre-assume a significant decision like that.
Okay. I got it.
And then her other, when, and I think that's something that's been lost on me for years. At what point do we say we want to explore a great orchestra or smaller class size or?
I can take that one. So part of what, so we have three parts that we wanted to talk to you about tonight. The first is just to go over the Finance 101 and really give you a chance to ask questions and understand from a balcony view what it looks like. The second, we wanted Tom to share about the budget assumptions, because that work that that committee does really, as Kristen said, sets the sandbox for where we think we might be. As we move forward, if we're on or off with enrollment, we make the best guess based on the educated folks in the room looking at data and the trends and that kind of thing that we can. The third piece we wanted to do is have you look at this graphic that we shared with you that is a draft. And the reason for this is we're trying to help folks understand not the budget cycles. Because we could have a conversation, we could have had a conversation 6 months ago about, let's say, orchestra, fourth grade orchestra. Can we do anything about it until we talk about what money might need to be set aside, how it might impact other things? No. So what we're trying to help you see, and we'll look at this again on Friday, is Friday you'll be having some conversations about priorities and looking where we are with current budget so you can start making some of those decisions. The thing is, with our meeting on Friday, we also have to think and remember that we have a couple of months of community feedback coming up with your strategic plan. It is the Portrait of a Graduate, 2 sessions with that, where people will be coming and visiting and sharing their ideas of what's important for our kids. You have the most likely to succeed conversations that are based on future thinking for our kids and what's important. It was interesting last night, we had the parent PTO leaders here, and they went through a process for that and came up with very similar trends from what we've seen from the think tank. So you have this process that you're going to be engaged in as a board to help understand what the community wants and needs are. So you'll have board ideas about wants and needs and priorities. You'll have community feedback about wants and needs and priorities. And then your job will be to looking at these priorities that we have collectively, what fits in our World's Best Workforce plan? Because your World's Best Workforce is your strategic plan moving forward. Where we've gotten caught in the past, and I don't have to belabor this with you, is that we've had grand plans, but we haven't talked about how we're going to fund it. And so now we're matching this and all this gathering with your preliminary budget that you look at in June. When you're looking at, if you look at the cycles, we're trying to help you have your budget aligned with your World's Best Workforce. And so that's all of a timing thing. So as you look at this graphic that we have, I know that there's a lot there. It's a draft because there may be things that you say don't make sense. But what we're trying to help you do with this graphic is show the different phases that a school district goes through year after year when we try to determine what was spent, what we currently have, and how do we bring that forward based on a lot of if-thens that Kristen mentioned earlier. So what typically should happen is you set your projections before you set that budget. Then once we have the budget, we can do training for our staff. And then once we have the training for the staff, we can implement a program. Now, a program like fourth grade orchestra, our teachers are amazing and can take that and pretty quickly, through the hiring process and other things, implement a program. Some things, like if you have a emotional support program that we need to do a lot of training with our staff, that's not going to happen right away. You might say, all right, here's a priority. We want to set money aside in the budget for it, and then we're going to do the training, and then it might be a year out before we can actually implement. So what we're trying to do, I know it's a lot at one time, but we're trying to show the cycles of the budget and then where your wants and needs and priorities fit in, and how that, if it's done well, it meshes and supports each other. If it's not done well, you have competing interests of, we want this, but we haven't set aside money for that. If you have a balanced budget, and we know right now we don't, if you have a balanced budget, then if something comes into the system, you have to decide what's going to leave the system, unless you're looking at increasing revenue. So a lot of this presentation is to help you understand where our current revenue levels are, what we're asking for our community. Difficult to be adding programs and new ideas when we're trying to remain tax neutral. right? And so those are where you'll have to make some decisions about if we add this, then what program needs to look different.
Thank you. And does something like the flipping of the start times, for example, for high school, does that, I know that that's a very large project, but does that parlay into the budget conversations as well?
Yes.
And does that happen at the same, say we want to start talking about this, which I think we do, where in this process does that start occurring?
Well, the flow chart that we have for you with the conversations, we have, I think, starting February, March, and April. They don't necessarily need to be there. I think part of that will come from your conversation about what do you want for your graduates. When we talk about portrait of a graduate, part of that is, what do we need to do differently maybe at our secondary schools? That might be something where you say, to reduce stress for our kids, give them more sleep. We really think that's an important thing to do.
Okay.
We want the administration to go forward and do that.
Great. Thank you.
I had a question. So the team that you have, I think is the team that has been, or it's the same group for a while. How long has that group, or is it from the
Shelley's
initial
new.
time?
Yeah. It changes. I would say
I'm a
the
little-
SCEA people are pretty consistent.
Okay.
Board people changes, and I think principals changes as well. I would say that looking at the people who are on here, other than the board members and the administration, are really people who do most of the negotiating for their group. So Andy is president of the principals group. And Mark, I think, is the treasurer who has the knowledge behind the numbers for their group. And that's the same with Dr. Hill and Todd Kapsner and Darby Whitehill.
Okay. So one thought I had is, would it be, I think it would be appropriate to have parents on that group as well, some additional community members to bring a different perspective. Because, I don't know, I think, it isn't super clear to me exactly the purpose of the budget projection is, I remember when we went through this last year, it's to give you a sense of what's coming up over the next 3 years. So to me, it should have things in it like, like you said, if we're gonna change the school start times, or, I don't know. It felt like it didn't have enough information. And like, for example, I think, Tom, you just said, I agree with you, Jen. I have a million questions. I have a million questions on this. But one of them, I think you said there was an assumption of 4% increase every year, all 3 years in special ed. So, okay, maybe that's accurate. I would love to know what's that based on. What's happening in special ed? I want to go a little deeper into why was that included in this assumption? What's going on in special ed? Is there anything that could be done to affect that number? Could we find efficiency? That's probably not,
I think that's
right. But you know what I mean? Like, I just want more information than just saying, oh, well, we just assumed it was going to be 4%. Like, why? How did that conversation go?
Does that come to us when you bring the preliminary budget? Is that the first time the whole board usually sees these assumptions?
I'm trying to remember when the board saw the assumptions last year. It's not in June.
It was just around this time, I remember.
Yeah.
It was November, I think, if I remember correctly.
I can appreciate your question. I will address the special ed specifically, because we're significantly underfunded. It's not about the expenditure growth, it's about the revenue growth, of which the state caps the formula at 4%.
Mm-hmm.
They only allow a growth factor of up to 4%, so because...
so that's why it's 4.
That's why it's 4.
Okay.
Yeah. That was a specific
It's not
question,
really
but I can
based on
appreciate the
anything
context
in
of
reality of what's happening on the ground. It's just that's what the state says we have to.
The
that's
state
the
says you're
maximum.
getting no more than 4.
Okay.
That's what they're willing to spend at this time.
Yeah.
Correct.
This time.
So that's why the
That's the
committee
thing that's
said
helpful.
we're not
I
gonna
really
guess
get to know.
more than 4, because that's all we're gonna get.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
and I can appreciate you want parents involved. I'm the first one to say that that's important. I think that the problem becomes that in certain committees, the involvement, you know, we have the opportunity to talk to parents about, but, you know, the change in literacy aid is more of a function of administration versus talking about that. You know, we would love the, you know, for the change in compensatory revenue, all of that becomes important, you know, and by no means is the board representation limited to myself. You know, I'm more than happy to put more people on there. Obviously, you run into open meeting questions versus, you know, if someone wants to do that next go around. It just is a matter of, you know, the idea here was that there was a concern that someone other than a group of people were coming up with these decisions, and that, so Kristen opened it up to the groups that, who are mainly concerned about the budgeting is, and as we all know, 74% of our revenue goes to contracts, and so it was important to get those people, because those are the ones who are going to say to their members, we trust that what the district is saying they have available for contracts is what's available for contracts. That's really why the committee was formed, and then also to give a better understanding of, you know, we're not overly conservative, we're not overly liberal on our estimates. This is based upon some reason, so that at the end of the day, we know kind of what we can budget for.
Was there ever a time that
Yeah,
we
that
did
makes sense.
steps and lanes? I'm just wondering.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
When did that start?
pre-me, and it was pre-13.
Did you ask if we ever froze steps and lanes?
No, I'm just wondering, when did the steps and lanes?
A long time.
Oh, that's been
How
our
long is
It's
that?
not in the
before
contract for.
60s.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
It's in the
the
60s.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they go way
Oh
back.
my god.
They did that at the Catholic
That's
school back in
education.
1960.
Holy
George,
moly.
a couple of questions. First of all, I think this is an excellent intent, and for what you've done here, I think this is super. I think a couple things though that would help. One is when we get the write-out that we can study, spend a little time with it. I think what you might want to play an idea of is that I'm not sure, because immediately when you say, okay, we ought to have parents on here, and I'm a big parent advocate, I'm not sure as a running member of the committee that might work, but maybe somewhere along the line, you could have one or two meetings, the committee I'm talking about, where you solicit feedback or whatever. And it's just that, it's maybe an open forum opportunity to hear and listen. It doesn't mean you gotta nod and bob or agree, but it's an attempt to establish this is what we're doing. Same thing really you're doing tonight, only with a more formalized, okay, if you, because obviously there's people here tonight that have listened. It's hard sometimes just to listen and not react back. Plus, as we know, there might be some very excellent ideas from those observations as well.
Yeah, and I think that's how I see this going forward, is for the community to understand that it's not just one person in a back room coming up with these projections. It's a committee based upon these members, and that these were the assumptions based upon, you know, teachers who are in the buildings, administrators who are looking at the costs, et cetera, going forward, that there's a committee that does that. And yeah, I mean, if people have ideas as to looking at the growth in the district, you know, have we undercounted, have we overcounted? But yeah, I mean, that's, I think, going forward, the idea here is so that we all better understand how these finances work.
One of the areas that I enjoy the committee, but I really like the piece is when we talk about assumptions based on kind of our own, our own information. You know, I have the people that, my colleagues in my profession, the SCEA, you know, they have the teachers, you know, they have Ed Minnesota. Everybody's coming at it from a different lens, especially when it comes to legislative decisions. You know, what is TRA, what is PRA, what is, you know, the Gen Ed formula going to look like? That's a very interesting conversation because everybody is coming at it with kind of a powerful group of support, you know, like board members with AMSD&C and it's really a fascinating conversation when we have those particular items, so.
Back to Shelley's point, I think that, was the board also going in a direction that if we did have something that we wanted to bring forth, that we were then responsible for then identifying what it was we were willing to give up, so to speak? So class size, which is, for as long as I've been a parent, is something that's, incredibly important to me. I also know that I have to come up with $1 million to cut in other places. So, because I think it's really, I just can remember from the last retreat, I know I missed the most recent one, but if that was a direction we were going of where then the onus is on the board, because it's really easy for all of us to say, I want this, 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 and this. But then what are we willing to then cut? And so,
Well, and I actually think, I just want the opportunity for the discussion. That's kind of where I'm at.
right.
I-
But I think with that has to come a
Right.
conversation. What
Oh,
are we gonna
absolutely,
cut?
yeah, I absolutely agree.
Which
And
I think
do.
is fine, but I think sometimes the level that we know the budget is different from, like, where am I gonna pick $1 million out? Like, that's a admin and board decision, that's not just us. And I don't think any of us are saying we should add something.
Exactly.
And
Just
ignore
have,
everything
just looking
else.
for the discussion.
Right.
Even,
Well, we
even
have
part
done
of
that for an
that
awful lot of
discussion.
years. We've
What-
added,
Yeah,
and we haven't deducted.
yeah. I think though, something that would be useful sometime, and again, Denise, that's probably a question for you in some ways, is even where do you get to this stage, price it out? If you're gonna do fourth grade orchestra, what does it look like? Or if Paula's question, and I completely agree, how much do you have to spend to bring down class size? So what does it look
Right.
like? Or what are some of the dimensions of that? Because otherwise people don't realize, sometimes myself included, how overwhelming that can be.
Well, I think for me, what I'm finding that's important is that encompassing all this conversation is the strategic plan in the world's best workforce. So that, for me, my focus now has to be, if I want to add a program or take away a program, how does that affect our strategic plan? If we want to do fourth grade orchestra, where in the strategic plan of world's best workforce does that fit? And that helps me focus my, because I think we all have programs that we could think, yeah, let's do this, because I think as George said, we have had an approach of adding and not subtracting. Subtracting is horrible, we were all there when we had to put the
Yeah.
little stickers on programs we were gonna cut. And it's horrible.
And I think we've just been lacking maybe a process to do that. I really do.
Yeah.
Not even, I hate always the fourth grade orchestra, but, another, again, the switching of the bell times, I feel like that's such a macro level, positive thing, and, let's start having those just strategic discussions to get there. And I feel like this is a step in the right, this has really been beneficial, so.
And I wanna just make sure that we're not boxing ourselves in, like, here's the
Yeah.
assumptions, you have nothing else. You can do
I
it.
agree, I
want us to
absolutely
be able
agree.
to say, here's our
Right.
vision, how can we make that happen? And then maybe you figure out you can't, there's no way you can make that happen.
Right.
Let's have the discussion, see if we can.
Agreed.
Well, is it desirable? Is it feasible? Is it
Sustainable.
sustainable, given the world's best workforce?
Right.
Which we have, I'll just say hanging over our shoulder. That's directing our vision of what we add or subtract, to Tom's point.
I welcome the conversation. Would you say that the budget projection process is kind of like looking at, with everything, all those expenses without the 11% or something that we had to work with that was kind of like wiggle room?
That's all.
Would you say like these are the things we know to be true, absolutely, there's no, this is gonna happen, kind of, or? I
Yeah.
don't know that they're known to be true. I think that's why we have a group, because a couple of the things, when you look at the data, there's trend and you can see, maybe read with me, it goes down, maybe 100,000 each year, so you can just say, okay, we can project forward that it's gonna go down probably. It's probably
The
not
cost
gonna
of
go
it or
up.
something,
Yep.
yeah, right.
But something I think that we spent the most time was trying to figure out enrollment, looking at really closely, we spend a lot of time talking about that. We spend a lot of time thinking about what the legislature might do. And so people report back from MSBA and from MASBO and different places, organizations, what they're hearing legislatively. And I think many people have shared that health and human services is, you know, big on a lot of our legislators' list, and it might not be education at the top. So we talked about what that might look like.
Yeah.
Those are probably the
Well,
two biggest.
and to that health piece, a couple of the people on the committee are on the insurance committee in the district. So they would go back to corporate health and say, what do you project over the next couple of years? And then they would bring that to this budget assumption. So those figures are guesses from corporate health rather than really guesses from the committee. You know, a lot of it would be our guesses on enrollment,
Best
stuff
guess
like that,
on
but
one
some of it
thing.
is the best guess from corporate health, and this is what Blue Cross is telling them going forward.
The other thing with that 11% too is that just I think the key term that Kristen shared was it's unassigned from a government level. It doesn't mean it's just sitting there not spent. The majority of that 11% is all of it is programming that for the most part is already in place. So if we have a math curriculum coming through and we know we have to buy textbooks for that, part of that 11% has been budgeted out over 3 years that's sitting in our curriculum budget that makes up a percentage of that 11%. So it isn't that it's free sitting there, it's just not
Oh, I know.
specifically,
Right.
no, but it's important, I think, for, not just for here, for everyone to understand that it's that specificness of assigned by someone other than the district or unassigned. That just means we can choose to make a choice with the money.
Which I think
So,
is the
but that's
biggest
where,
point.
that's where
is-
the orchestra, if you were gonna
Right.
do that at your expense, or smaller class sizes, or whatever it is, that's what we're looking at, because the rest of it isn't really open to the negotiation, right?
Because
Or-
Don't- I think one of the things you've gotta do is break down that 11% and for people to see actually how that's planned out, because like I say, it's not fun money over here.
But I think it's really easy to get where because we do choose, right? We get to choose, like, we're gonna keep this or we're not. I think it's easy to just say, we actually don't have any wiggle room because this is what's already in place. And I don't think as often we look at it and say, okay, is this still the way that we wanna go, or do we want to go in this direction instead?
I have another thought too. What about the idea of, I know various different people have talked about marketing, you know, and trying to grow our enrollment. I mean, is that part of this? Is this an appropriate place to talk about that? I mean, if we want to affect our budget, I mean, what could we be doing to actually grow the enrollment that might have an impact on some of these projections? I mean, is that something we thought about?
I think that falls into the bucket of what Mia does of the slide that Kristen showed with your tax base. It's all part of that discussion, right? What are you willing to spend to add in revenue sources, whether that's adding kids to the district, whether that's your levying dollars in the two pockets, or all the other stuff. I think that is part of that whole, where are you willing to and able to gain revenue sources from if you're not going to relieve the system of something like that. You've got to figure out, okay, so
And I think it can be a both and, right? So investing in the programming, right? So we have, you know, whatever, I never heard Dr. Dawson is, whatever access point a student enters our system, it's going to be strong, it's going to be robust, it's going to have system and structures to support it. So, you know, attracting students with the quality of the program that we have.
Yep.
In addition to, you know, just directed marketing.
I agree.
Which was part of the basis for, right, the middle school model, ninth grade academy, Spanish immersion, preschool, in all of our schools. Those were the things that we said would bring people, and I think those are the things that Chris has numbers for that have shown that they are bringing people into the district.
We've had very intentional conversations about that too. I mean, it's one thing to put a billboard on the side of the road, that's great, but if you don't have a good program that people want to be a part of, it does you no good. So it's really the two pieces together. You have to have that solid programming, and then you have to go out and sell it.
Okay, have we had enough
So are we doing 102 next, or 102? We don't go into the 201 series?
Friday morning will be next up. Come
Thank
fresh.
you.
This is 101.